2/I Introduction to Realistic Philosophy. So the philosophical science that anyone on earth can reach is the foam of things. Never will my science be adequate to reality. So without stopping, a philosopher, in the literal sense of the word, will have to know that he must progress. He must humble his very knowledge, before a reality. Let me explain. Take for example a particular area of philosophy called psychology. If I say, for example, that women are more attached to small children than men. Is it true, said like that? I would say, to check if it's true, I have only one master, that's the real thing. So I will go and see the real, so the women, the men, who are finally the laboratory of the philosopher, and I will find that it is true, but not always. That's true, most of the time. Just because the moms are carrying the baby, because they are attached to it, viscerally, and maybe the dad was a bit more outwardly, I would find a number of cases of people, moms, who do not have no attachment to the child who has just been born, and who even sometimes rejects it. On the other hand, I would find dads who would rather die than to see, at the time of a divorce, the children, leaving the house, in any case, who claim a right of access equivalent to the mother. So if my psychology that I just did, wants to be true and well, she will submit to reality, and she will say this, simply, most cases, to calculate the exact rate of cases, she will be able to use statistics, that is to say the contribution of a modern science called modern psychology, which will integrate it into the mathematical tool. Aristotle did not have a mathematical tool for him, so he said, most times no figures, and finally it was sometimes better because the numbers in large sociological surveys often say, depending on the question asked, what is expected of the investigation. Most times, women are attached to small children more than men, but not always. There are therefore cases where it is the opposite. If what I say is true, then I could say that in the proposition I just gave, I have reached the truth, and that is the only goal. The goal of philosophy is this adequacy, as I said. So to conclude this first lesson, I would say that maybe some people who have done the philosophy in terminal in France, will be surprised by this way of defining the philosophy. They may rather expect to study systems, Marxism, Freudianism, etc. I will explain in Lesson 3, that in fact, this way of defining philosophy as the presentation of a series of authors, is called rather the history of philosophy, and if it is called philosophy, since about 50 years, it is because it appeared, in the generation of philosophers, a kind of mistake to say that there was a truth. To say that there is a truth, it almost meant to be intolerant, and therefore to avoid this risk, politically correct coming from a generation that no longer supported precisely, the fact that we impose, in their childhood, truths, and who have taken the opposite extreme in a teenage crisis, saying that in order to avoid imposing a truth, we will present a whole series of systems to show that in fact everything is relative. This is a crisis of philosophy. Philosophy, if it had been humble, before, say in the generation of the 30s, 40, would not have had this backlash. But as, very often, there are more parrot teachers, teachers who repeat what they themselves have read in books of realistic philosophy, than real researchers who rediscover the truth, at the same time as their students. This is why there was a violent reaction in the generation that followed the war. I'm going back with my great teacher in philosophy, Father Marie-Dominique Philippe, who is a Dominican and studied philosophy for 3 years and who was really my mentor, my trainer, and I returned to that original attitude of admiration for reality, which is the only master. So obviously, why give a course on the internet? So it means put a teacher, an authority, in front of people who will listen. Well, it's better to tell them that all that is said in these videos is like a tutor at the beginning. The goal is that in the end, we separate from the teacher, to have only one master beyond the teacher, the real. Aristotle had already told him about his master Plato that he heard nonsense. He had said, "Plato, I love him very much, but the truth more." He had separated from his philosophical system, to return to the realist. Father Marie-Dominique Philippe and I say the same thing. The purpose of these lessons is that the person learns, that his only teacher, is the observation of the reality to which he submits humbly. It will, without stopping, change its systems of thought if it finds in reality, something that contradicts it. It will be possible for this person to use all the systems that have existed. Why not use Marx, Freud, Nietzsche? Because there is no ideology that does not have a little bit of truth somewhere. I would say, perhaps I will show occasionally how these philosophies are ideologies. That means they do not actually look for the real, but they love the idea of the real, that they have done it. For Marxism, it's very clear. To affirm that we will create paradise on earth, by suppressing private property, and by making everyone work generously in the love of humanity, for everyone, was a mistake that could be discovered in 5 minutes. To know that it is not true. People do not want, with a few exceptions, 10% of the population, to work for the collective. We work for his wife, for his children. It is up to the state to use those forces that are ultimately selfish, which are an intrafamilial generosity, to make the whole society enrich itself. They could have realized it very quickly, but since the system was more important than the man, when the man opposed the system, he cut off the men's heads. This is called an ideology. There, on the contrary, one submits to reality. It means that, if we ever build, by pride, because we are all a little proud, a system that does not correspond to reality, then we evacuate the system, we modify it with the only master, always, the real. That's it, for this first lesson. Introduction to Realist Philosophy, Lesson 2. Introduction to the second lesson to philosophy and especially to metaphysics, I would like to address a question that is specifically addressed to Christians. Indeed, I cannot deny that I teach primarily theology and religion in Belgium. Of course, most of my listeners may be Christians who will be interested in training for theology. So, this realistic philosophy, the Catholic Church, through Pope Benedict XVI recently, asked to reintegrate it into training institutes, into seminaries and so on. Why is it so important when one is formed in theology to begin by doing, at length, the Church asks 3 years, of the realistic philosophy, centered on the knowledge of, not any reality, it is not a question of knowing the mosquito, although the object of philosophy is all the real. No. Centered mainly on a particular object, the man. Know the man. The reason is that Christian revelation is given to persons who at first have a human nature, and it only flourishes in the order of nature. Besides, it's coherent. Revelation therefore speaks of a supernatural salvation, namely, the face-to-face, eternal vision of God, the Creator of the world. She also explains that we are all, at least those who have agreed to love this God there. Others make other choices, which God fully respects. Well, who is the one who created this human nature that goes beyond that, grafted on this life that goes beyond human nature, because it is not natural for man to see a being face an infinite being, the Creator. But the one who created it is precisely the Creator. So if he had the idea of creating the man, we see that we can study it, we see it with his eyes. So it's good that he had to put things in there that are not in contradiction with the revelation and that will, on the contrary, help to deeply understand the revelation. There can be no contradictions between a truly realistic philosophy, that is, that which has as its sole object reality, humbly known, and Christian theology, if it is well understood. Why? Because for a Christian both disciplines study realities that have a single origin to know God. So, inevitably, one must not be afraid to look at reality, by one's own intelligence. If ever a thing, in the reality observed by the philosophical method, therefore by its natural reason, seems to oppose a dogma, there are two possibilities. In the field of his real life, we went too fast, either in the domain of dogma, we misunderstood the dogma. I will give an example. There is a Christian dogma that says that it is the fault of one man that death has entered the world. Then, theological explanation of the Middle Ages, before Adam and Eve sinned, the animals ate grass and would not die. So still explanation of the Middle Ages, the animals had to be created 5 days before the man and to live all the time on earth. Now, it turns out that modern science, with data that is confirmed by all kinds of disciplines, prove that millions of years before man there existed creatures that have teeth, ferocious. It also proves by studying the ecology that it is not possible that there exist on Earth only herbivores. That's because herbivores are small, and they eat all the grass, and then everyone dies of hunger. Well, who will give in? Is it going to be the Catholic theology of the Middle Ages? Is it going to be modern science? In this area, since it does not concern salvation, the question of animals, the dating of the creation of the world etc. does not concern the question of eternal salvation. And theology will reform itself by saying, I misunderstood the dogma. That show it goes in the end. Since it is found that long before the existence of man, animals died and gave huge layers of oil and coal, that's death, these are only corpses, these things. That means that the death that has entered the world by the sin of one is not the death of animals, it is the death of man, and therefore, originally the man and the woman should not die. So we are going to say that it is a new theology, to say that they had an immortal body. No, their body was the same, as the one we have. Except that, normally, Christian theology would say, at the end of their lives they should have passed naturally through the power of God, from this world to another, by assumption, without passing through death, as has been done the Virgin Mary for Catholic dogma. As we can see, there is a collaboration between the two. Saint Francis de Sales, to explain it, said reason, therefore the domain of philosophy, and faith, therefore the domain of theology, must walk together as two affectionate. Let's take the opposite example. Modern science seems to say that, in fact, humanity has evolved over millions of years, was at first thick brutes, who behaved like monkeys, and that little by little, slowly, spirituality has emerged to its peak in our time. So for modern science, there is no first man. but there is a slow emergence, starting from the improving material, of the mind. Now, the Catholic dogma says that the spirit, in the sense of spiritual intelligence and free will, are not made of matter, but that they use matter, namely the brain which, actually has progressed and improved, and that spirit, being of a domain quite other than the mere material objects that the brain can understand. The brain is capable of intelligence in animals. Intelligence to catch a prey, intelligence to seduce a female, to have social relations in a group, but animal intelligence is unable to reach things that have nothing to do with matter, which is coherent, since animal intelligence is related to a material brain only. So the Church has asserted that human intelligence, which reaches objects that are not material, such as the concept of eternity, the concept of infinity that cannot be represented but against which we understand very well, and that an animal will not be able to understand at all. And although this human intelligence and the will that accompanies it to act, have no organ, they are created directly by God. So who will be right here? For a Christian theologian it is faith that is going to be right. When he goes to analyze things much more deeply, he will realize that, in fact, the science I was just talking about is not really science. It is rather a form of philosophy which, for a reason of materialistic faith, claims that everything goes out of the brain and can explain everything by the matter of the brain. But she has no proof, because she never touched the way the concept is formed in the brain. So she sees that when we think, for example, of something like the infinite, it lights up in some parts of the brain neurons that receive more blood, more electrical activity. That's no wonder, the philosopher will say. When we think about what the infinite is, we start by forming a small material image of a body that is very long and to which we add bits, without stopping. So we have an image that is material and therefore well connected to the brain. Only the understanding of the very concept of the infinite, something that has no limits, is beyond this small representation. What we understand is not material anymore. It is an abstract concept of all materiality. So it goes beyond the realm of what a material cause can do theoretically. So then, the theologian will say, "Attention, philosopher scientist, maybe you're going a little fast. Your domain is not to give only hypotheses, it is to demonstrate them, and for the moment be honest, you have not demonstrated anything of what you are saying." This example shows how a good theologian should perhaps be a pretty good scientist, at least on the side of epistemology, that is to say, to know what is the scientific method, and in any case it is essential to be a good philosopher. Having understood the philosopher's philosophy, knowing how to discern what he has experienced, what he has demonstrated and what is only hypothesis, and one has the right to make assumptions, even materialistic. This is not the problem. The problem is that we do not have the right to say, when this hypothesis is not proven, that it is. Because at that moment we fall into what I could call a form of ideology, or in any case, a form of philosophical faith, which is contradictory, since the philosopher, by definition, does not believe in anything, but demonstrates all. The theologian, revealed theology, he has the right to rely on arguments of authority since he does not have access to his science. Its science by definition is revealed. So he relies on the authority of a person who cannot lie to him, according to his faith, and who is God. So he, the theologian, he has only arguments of authority. If he's a Catholic theologian, he'll say, "I'm relying on God's revelation of salvation." and which passes by the interpretation of the saints, in the Church, and which is confirmed, from time to time, by the magisterium of the Pope. If he is orthodox theologian, he will say, I rely on the same thing, therefore the revelation coming from God and passing through the saints. I do not believe, the orthodox theologian will say, to the Pope, and therefore I am confronted with opinions that often contradict each other. If I am a Protestant theologian, I would say, I only believe in the revelation coming from God, which passes exclusively through the text of the Scriptures. I do not believe in saints, because they can invent interpretations. I rely only on the text alone. Each of these theologies are arguments of authority, a book, and a tradition for what is orthodox, a book, a tradition and confirmation of a pope by Christ to establish after Catholic interpretation. In any case, in the three cases they are arguments of authority, which will not be part of philosophy. Then I would like to give other examples that show how important it is to make philosophy. The first example will deal with the use of metaphysics and the second with the use of a philosophy called ethics, moral philosophy. So first example, the use of metaphysics. Metaphysics, according to the terminology of Aristotle, which was formalized in the Middle Ages, is the part of philosophy which studies the being of things, as they exist. This philosophy raises questions such as what makes me a unique being. Since I was conceived until now, I am the same being and yet there is nothing of material that is common in me. This approach to being as being, will serve him greatly if he is theologian. If only to study a particular being who causes big problems, namely Christ. Christ, says the Catholic dogma, is the person of God, the unique Word, who became man by assuming, entirely, a complete human nature. So, is Christ a human person or is he the person of God? Answer: Christ is not a human person, it is the person of God who became man. Well then, if he is not a human person and yet he has a human intelligence, as a man he has a human body, he eats like a man. Well, the Catholic dogma will answer, it has a human nature and its human nature is entirely assumed to form a single being with its divine nature. He is therefore the person of God made man with a complete human nature and a complete divine nature. It is complicated. To be precise, in the notions of nature, of persons, of substance, of subject, one must have made a precise metaphysics. Well, Saint Thomas Aquinas, the metaphysics in question he received from Aristotle. On this point, I think there is nothing to add to Aristotle. Aristotle, who invented metaphysics, was and still is the great master in this matter. He has had many commentators and some criticize him for notions he did not develop as the notion of the human person. But basically I think it's the master of metaphysics. If we do not have realistic metaphysics, we will not be able to say anything about the very being of Christ. This is a central theological issue for Christian theology. Another question posed to metaphysics is to know what is a human person. We will see that for Western metaphysics the human person is a reality that subsists even after death. Aristotle said it, whereas for the Eastern metaphysics that comes from Hinduism we are only appearances, and if we reincarnate from body to body then it is precisely because we believe that we are people, whereas that it is of the appearance, the wind. We are nothing but the great all, a small part, an avatar of this God who is the great all, the universe, and who reveals himself to himself. It is therefore a very different metaphysics that is in the East. What is the good? Currently in the Western world, children are aborted for up to 12 weeks when there is no parental project. A small child, whom parents want to keep, is considered a human being since there is a parental project. So that means that we define a human person in relation to his relationship to parents, and that if there is no relationship, this little human person, or rather, this embryo, is rejected. If there is not pregnancy project, can, without abortion problems, and even possibly make manipulations, make his body an object of experimentation, etc. That means that in our modern age, for 40 years, a new metaphysics has emerged where what defines a human person is his relationship to others, and that if there is no longer a relationship, either because whether one is too small, or because one is an old man who has lost his head, one is more truly worth living. Is this metaphysics true? And how to criticize it? We see it. It is a real philosophical question and also touches on Christianity. So I said I would take a second example that demonstrates the importance of realistic philosophy. This is the question of moral philosophy, of ethics. I was amazed, when I was young, by following the lessons of Father Marie-Dominique Philippe, to see that he was developing his morality, not like Saint Thomas Aquinas, by taking the study of acts abstractly. What is the intention of life? What is the choice of a means? What is the use of this means? What differentiates a moral act from an artistic act, etc. But he had centered on the study of the love of friendship. In studying the love of friendship, he studied what life intention is, the intention of life in friendship. What is the choice of means to conquer a friendship, etc., etc. It is only later, while doing theology, that I realized that it was absolutely brilliant to do this, because in fact Christian theology, all moral, develops nothing but the study of a supernatural friendship between God and our soul. A true love of friendship, says Saint Thomas Aquinas. What characterizes the charity, and which is unique in the Christian religion, the Muslims refuse it by saying, one cannot have a love of friendship for God, a big one cannot love a very small one. But St. Thomas Aquinas says God is lowered, it raises man, for precisely there may be an intense love of friendship. And the expression love of friendship is not strong enough. Christ will speak rather of passion, to signify the totality that this love takes, between God and the soul. Having studied for years with Father Marie-Dominique Philippe the ethical philosophy from the study of friendship, I had only to make an instantaneous slip to understand these complicated concepts that were in charity treated by Saint Thomas Aquinas in an abstract way. I had only to slip in a few moments to understand these concepts complicated by Saint Teresa of Avila on the 7 dwellings of the growth of a friendship of the soul with respect to God. In fact, it was exactly the same path that a friendship can have between a man and a woman during a lifetime. The friendship is initially very passionate and becoming more and more spiritual as the tests refine this passion. When I compared all the treatises of moral theology with this extraordinary contribution that this concrete study from Father Marie-Dominique Philippe had given, when I looked at the complicated way in which those who did not have this philosophical contribution, treated notions of grace, notions of loving responses to God, the role that grace had in relation to this answer, etc. When I looked at their complication to treat it and the ease with which it was done by relying on a realistic, concrete philosophy of a love of friendship, I thanked my master, Father Marie-Dominique Philippe, for having followed all these courses. I can even say that if there are certain courses of theology that are on the internet that concern precisely the study of grace, moral theology, and also the study of the mystical life with Saint Teresa of Avila, and if it is easy to understand, that's what we are told most of the time, but it comes from that, having received, for years, a simple philosophy course, based on the observation of reality and full of examples. Not just an abstract course like on notions like the intention of life in oneself. What are the main subjects? Who should study? Someone who makes philosophy in order to become a theologian, in order to study theology. Well, I would say that I see three fundamentally. To understand it first, I would like to recall that according to Aristotle, philosophy studies all man, and that finally there are 7 main axes of study of man. 3 axes, according to Aristotle, are speculative. It means that they study things, to study them, by the simple thirst to know the reality and the structure of a man. The first, what they call the first philosophy, is precisely the fact of studying our being, because basically we cannot say anything about a man if at first he does not exist. That's why he calls it, Aristotle, the first philosophy. So, this metaphysics, this first philosophy which, moreover, is developed by Father Marie-Dominique Philippe and which will probably be put on the internet by the Saint Jean community, I think it is very important to study. It is necessary to study the notions of substance and the notions of act. With that, it's essential. We will have the basis, to come to understand, in theology, what it is that the person of Christ, what it is that the human person who tends towards his perfect action, in the beatific vision at the end of the world. The second essential discipline to study, always, in this speculative philosophy is called the philosophy of the living. Indeed, it is certain we exist, but a pebble finally exists just as much as us. To exist is to be, and one is or one is not. So we are, but a pebble also exists. However, we find that we have a lot more perfection than a pebble. We are not just an inert body. This philosophy, which studies the fact that we are moving, that we are capable of having a life, is called the philosophy of the living, and it is essential to study it, because it is it that concretely manifests the immense complexity of the human person, who is composed, as Aristotle says, but not only him, all philosophies, because it is true, composed of 3 degrees of life, unified, to form a single being. Our vegetative life, which is common with plants, we breathe, our cells divide, and it's unconscious, it's chemical. Secondly, our sensitive life, which is common with animals and which plants do not have. We see, we have 5 senses and sometimes even others. We have not only feelings but inner feelings to ourselves. When we study animals, we realize that they even have more than that. Higher animals have a sensible intelligence, to invent stuff, to better survive and reproduce. Aristotle called this sensible intelligence the estimative. They consider what is harmful and useful for their survival and reproduction, and they invent new ways. Very few, of course, because, unfortunately, they do not have a cultural transmission as intense as ours. Nevertheless, we also have these faculties.